Hello! Welcome to Improving Design in Open Source. I'm going to talk a little bit about what design is in relationship to open source and how we might improve our projects to make the most of everything that designers have to offer. But who am I? Hi! I'm Django Skorupa. I use he, they pronouns for the most part, and you can find me at either of these two places, although I don't really use Twitter very much. I'm the lead UX designer at Open at RIT. As part of our academic open programs office, we work with professorial fellows to help them better improve the experiences of their open academic projects. I'm also a recurring panelist at the Sustain Open Source Design podcast, which you can find at the link there. I'll make sure that the link is also included in the description that I send off to the editors here so that it'll be in the video as well. I studied industrial design when I was in college, which is not that different to what I do now, except that it happens in the physical world. We study ergonomics and human factors, specifically working on things that we touch and feel and interact with to ensure that they've got the best possible feeling when we use them, right? You could call that physical user experience. One of the main things that we focus on is honesty in design and materials, which is to say we never try and make something that it is not in the work that we do. And we never try and make it out of something that is not what it is. The end goal is everything looks exactly the way it is because that is the way it should be. And this is done by understanding and advocating for the end user in what we do, right? The majority of our work happens before the design even starts. To understand and develop personas, which we'll talk about later, in order to better sculpt our own design process to meet the needs of our perceived users. Which is not unlike what I do now, which is user experience design. That's what UX stands for. And we focus on ergonomics as well, but it's ergonomics of the digital space. How easy is it for someone to use a website that we've made? How does the app that we've built inspire people to continue using it? Perhaps it doesn't. Well, let's address that as well. And to do that, we use honesty in content and practices. Our materials are usually the same. It's almost entirely digital. So honesty of copy, honesty of design practices, honesty that what you see and interact with is actually what's going to happen for you is extremely important. And we do that the exact same way we work in industrial design, by developing an understanding of the end user so that we can properly advocate for their needs during every step of the process. That is design. I worked in design professionally for about 3 years. I started as a model maker, then moved on to a fabricator, and then when COVID hit, moved into the digital sphere permanently and never looked back. I worked first as a content developer, and then later as a content designer, playbook designer, and finally my current iteration, which is UX design. But in the interest of honesty, even though I've interacted with open source projects my entire life, in fact, a lot of my design work in college wouldn't have happened without them, my time in open work is about 10 months. The position that I hold currently, I've only held for 10 months. But don't let that shock you, because what I'm doing here is I'm coming into this as an outsider, which you'll find the majority of designers in this field are. Either because the project that they'd like to work on isn't necessarily welcoming, or they don't even know where to start in open source. Designers are only beginning to truly start to open up to open work and open source in the last couple of years, which is great, and we'll talk about why that is later on. But first, we have to talk about design. And we can't do that without talking about design thinking. Now, IDEO is a really incredible design agency that in the last 30 years or 40 years has pioneered what they refer to as design thinking. I don't really think they came up with the term, but they offer classes in it and teach it and have standardized a lot of the terms that we use when we talk about and refer to the design process, right? So design thinking, as Tim Brown put it on the IDEO website for design thinking is a human-centered approach to innovation that draws from the designer's toolkit to integrate the needs of people, the possibilities of technology, and the requirements for business success. But the thing about design thinking as a broad stance is that for the most part, it's making available to individuals who are not working in design the methodology by which designers do what they do. So the definition that I've always liked for design thinking is that design thinking is applying the scientific method to your creativity to best engineer an experience. Done, right? So what does that look like? Well, design thinking is an iterative process that moves from empathy to definition to ideation to prototyping and to testing, and then back all the way to the beginning again, iterating as much as you can, collecting feedback at every step of the process. By doing that, it becomes itself process-oriented. It encourages the users and practitioners to think in systems, considering underlying causes and gathering as much feedback from stakeholders as possible, right? Just like how painting is not just the action of putting paint on a wall of a house, but it is also cleaning the walls, prepping the walls, taping off places that you don't want to get paint, covering the floors, all of that. So too, design thinking is this entire process, right? But designers don't oftentimes refer to design thinking as design thinking. We just refer to it as design. Because design is the whole process. It's research, definition, brainstorming, content strategy, copywriting, branding, usability, UX auditing, accessibility, microcopy, typography, information architecture. And yes, I ran that list off the page for a specific reason, and that's because it's so much more than this, right? Design is all of this, and different people specialize at different steps of the process. And design has always been a part of open source. Whether it's human interaction, usability expert, copywriter, user flow developer, technical writer, all of that falls under the envelope of design. The importance of design has always been understood, but it's only recently that we've labeled it as such, right? But it's always been a part of open source. And designers care, and we want to help. As much as everyone else is a stakeholder in open source projects, so too are designers. And that means that we have the exact same motivations to contribute to those projects as anyone else. The long and short of design education is that designers oftentimes become designers to help solve problems that matter to people, right? We didn't all become designers so we could make a very pretty looking toaster or a really remarkable doorknob or chair, right? We became designers because there were problems in our own lives or problems that we saw in the world around us, and we thought to ourselves, well, boy, I wonder why someone isn't working on that, why someone hasn't developed a solution to that problem. And so we went to school to do exactly that. And if you're a project maintainer for an open source project, you're probably nodding along going, wow, that's exactly why I'm doing this. Maybe you're not. But the philosophy behind design and the pursuit of design is very, very similar with the philosophy behind the pursuit of open source contribution. And we can use that to our advantage. But how can design help improve your project? That's the most important thing about this, because if you don't understand how design can help improve everything that you do, then there's no real need for, or there's no perceived need, rather, for, edit that out. But how can design improve your project? Without understanding what design can do for you, there's no perceived need to increase accessibility for designers. So it's my goal as someone who's been in design for a little while and been in open source for significantly less time, to encourage others to think about design even when they may not perceive why it's necessary. First off, design can help you understand your contributors. The first step of that design thinking process that we discussed earlier is often listed as discovery or empathize. It is the research phase of your process. And we can use that to determine what users need and what they struggle with and inform how we determine what we can do to help. But we can do the exact same thing in a meta way for a project itself. By interviewing your stakeholders and your contributors, we can make archetypal versions of those stakeholders and contributors. Each one of those archetypes we refer to as personas, and they have their own needs and wants, and they inform every step of the process afterwards. Let's take a look at one. This is Sophia. She doesn't exist, right? But all of the people who I spoke to create Sophia when I was working on redesigning the website for Open at RIT were real, and they had very real needs and wants and desires and frustrations. So, with all of their needs and wants and with their own stories, I was able to create a persona of best fit for the people who work with our website. Rather, I was able to create a persona for the students. There was also one made for professors who interact with our website because they had significantly different needs, wants, goals, frustrations, etc. Right? So with those two in mind, this is Sophia. She chose RIT so she could engage in an already established free and open source software community during her study. She wants to pursue work post-graduation in the open world and is using Open at RIT to jumpstart that career. Right? All of these things were pieces that people spoke to me about. Breaking it down further, these are all the different sections. So her bio is amalgamated from interviews. Her demographic information, well, that's specific, but that's because I chose it to be specific. It's not a real headshot. It's grabbed from Pexels, which is, if you don't know, a phenomenal open source stock photo website. I use it all of the time in a lot of the work that I do, and it's extremely helpful. Her needs were specific. These were needs that jumped out at me when I was speaking to people about their needs in the process. They needed to know. One of them needed to know about open source projects on campus. One of them wanted to connect with professors affiliated with Open at RIT. And then a number of them wanted information about open source independent studies and information about contributing to Open at RIT. The same goes for the goals and the frustrations. These were common or things that jumped out at me specifically that I felt needed to be included in my consideration when I was building the website. And once we have them, we can understand their journey. We can use what we learn from building our personas to imagine how a contributor would move through the whole system. Would they stumble somewhere that you recognize that you hadn't seen before? If they do, then that's great. You can build around that. You've started to recognize problems before they've actually been... If you do recognize where they would stumble, well then congratulations. You've... Edit all this out. Once we understand our personas, we can better understand their journey. We can use what we understand and what we learn from building personas to then imagine how a contributor would flow through the system. Would they stumble somewhere that you recognize? Well, that's great. You've noticed a problem before it's left the drawing board, and now you can fix that problem and improve your alpha project before other people start to notice errors, right? What do you spot when you're in their shoes that you didn't spot earlier? Oftentimes when we're working in the design world, or in any project, we can fall into the trap of considering that our viewpoint is the most important viewpoint, which it isn't. When we develop personas and then plot their relevant pathways, we can break ourselves out of that mold and keep thinking about the most important people in the process, which is always the contributors and the stakeholders. Lastly, we can help you understand your process. This is the craziest thing. It's meta. When you use your research and your stakeholder personas to better understand how the users flow through your system, you can start to understand your own process even better. And then you can spot weak points before they get off the drawing board because you understand the way your project should work. You have an ideal pathway. That's good. That's design. Because in short, design is problem solving. On top of all of our meta work, all of our design systems work, designers are problem solvers. If we identify a specific issue, whether it be outreach, metric collection, or anything else really, we can solve that issue. We can propose specific changes. We can edit microcopy. We can change information architecture and improve visual hierarchy. All of these things solve specific problems that arise when we analyze our design systems. The same thing can be done for open source projects. In short, we can help. Designers are so valuable as members of the team, but we don't know how. We don't know where to start. Designers oftentimes feel like imposters in open source projects because the projects don't feel welcoming to them. And we oftentimes don't understand the process by which the project is being developed. So let's talk about changing that. Let's improve the process for designers. First off, we need to embrace design early on. The best order of operations for anything that you could do on a project is to make space in your community for designers at the earliest phase possible. When you are on the drawing board of drawing boards, brainstorming exactly where the scope of your project should lie, try and get designers with you. Designers who might be able to point you in the direction of accessibility tools. Designers who might be able to point you in the direction of considering copy very early on, considering web design early on. The best place to start problem solving, always, is at the start of the problem. But if you can't do that, provide access to everything. Everything in the overall mission. Design is, if you hadn't already guessed, very big picture. Make sure that that big picture is available to those seeking to contribute. We can avoid this sense of micromanagement in projects by providing all of the context at the outset and then trusting that the contributors, which in this case does include designers, take the steps that they consider best to achieve and support the overall mission. This means letting it go a little bit and assuming that you've provided all of the context, absolutely everything necessary, so that they'll be able to succeed. Because, and I'm going to hammer this home a lot, miscommunication and failure occurs when the mission is not properly understood. If I don't understand the scope the same way that you understand the scope, your needs won't make sense to me, and my needs, my perceived needs, won't make sense to you. This feeds right into introducing key contributors and stakeholders, right? Because you can't answer every single question because you're not the only step in the whole process. So how do we develop our personas? How do we analyze pathways? By interviewing contributors and stakeholders. So make them available. Make it easy for those people to be contacted and spoken to. Oftentimes they've been on a project longer than we have, and we can vocalize to them exactly what we're stuck on, and they can vocalize to us exactly what they're stuck on. And then we can clarify, and we can understand each other, and then open our eyes to the problems that we hadn't noticed. As I said before, good communication fosters a healthy community. That's funny. And then you need to understand what you need. We are good. Designers are great. But we're not that good. So, like, are you looking to improve information architecture? Are you looking to get better branding? Are you looking to improve your accessibility or improve your microcopy? Are you looking to develop personas? Are you looking to research the way people interact with your website? Document it, right? All of those things are design considerations, but without proper documentation, if someone asks for design help, I might suggest typefaces to them when realistically speaking, they needed someone to tell them how to make an accessible color on their site, right? Have an accessible difference between the color of their text and the color of their background. That's also something I can do. There's plugins that I can show you how to use all of those things. But if I don't understand what you need, I won't be able to provide the right help. In order to understand what you need, we have to talk about improving your documentation. Because oftentimes, when we're considering documentation, the people who need the documentation have not entered into the situation in which they need the documentation yet. So the documentation and the technical writing need to be done in a way that is comprehensive and easy to understand. Because you can't design for someone in a way that you can interview them and ask them what they need, because they aren't in the situation in which they are needing to interact with your documentation yet. So providing as much as you possibly can from the outset will set the right standard for the documentation creation later in the process. So the first thing to ask yourself when you're writing documentation is it welcoming? Right? Is the personality of your project reflected in your documentation? In other words, is it personable? I'm not saying, is it fun? Is it quippy? Is it pithy? Right? Now that might be the personality of your project, at which point, is it fun? Is it quippy? Is it pithy? But if the personality of your project is very technical, very rigorous, very easy go, but if the personality of your project is rigorous, technical, not easygoing, but rather comprehensive and context-oriented, and you make your documentation personable and pithy and quippy and all of these other positive adjectives, it might not match the mood or the perceived energy of the people who need that information. Next, is it comprehensive? Does the documentation represent, to the best of your abilities, the full extent relevant information? That's a really long way of asking, did you put everything that you know into the documentation? Or do you expect people to contact you for the full scope of information? Because that's another step in the process. If I can't, when I'm first starting out in the process, get all of the information that I need, and I have to actually reach out and speak with someone else, I mean, that's something that I can absolutely do. It's not something that I'm against, but it makes it more difficult for me to be a self-starter. We talked earlier about micromanagement being the result of misunderstood scope. Well, micromanagement can also be the result of ununderstood scope. If there's not enough information presented for me to understand the scope, I will require more micromanagement. And is it honest? If you don't have much information, state it, please. Does the documentation that you provide admit your current experience? Does it admit the current knowledge that you have? If you don't know anything, say it. Because someone who's entering into a project with you will go in there knowing that you don't know anything. They're not going to treat you like a moron. They're not going to treat you like an asshole. Scratch that. Is it honest? Does any documentation that you provide admit your current experience and knowledge that your team has? If you don't know something, say it. If I see that there's not much information present on your documentation, see the question about comprehension, and then I reach out to someone for more information and you don't have that information, now I've entered into this project and made myself involved and didn't fully understand the scope of the project that I was getting involved with. By practicing honesty in our content and honesty in our information communication, we can attract people who are comfortable with that level of comprehension. And to do that, we need to provide the necessary level of context. By providing the proper level of context and the proper level of communication across all of this, we can provide a comprehensive presentation of the scope of the project to outsiders who are looking to join on the project. So ask yourself when you're writing documentation, is it welcoming? And does it invite contribution? After all of that, you've made your documentation very personable to the personality of your project. You've made it comprehensive. You've made it honest, right? And does that invite contribution? If your project says, hey, we know nothing about any of this stuff, but we would like someone to come in and spoon feed us all of this information. I mean, you might get someone who's really, really devoted in teaching. But you might be hard-pressed to find contributors. So, when you're explaining all of that, when you're explaining how much you know, why you know it, also explain what you need and how you need it. Do you know what sort of specific step in the design process you need assistance with? Or do you know that just design might help? What do you think is happening on your project currently, and how do you think it could be fixed? This is the same thing as driving a car to a mechanic shop and saying, fix it, versus saying, hey, when I turn to the left between 30 and 35 miles an hour, there's a vibration that I can feel from the right side of the car. One of those gives me a place that I can look and I can start to figure out exactly where the problem is. And the other one means that I'm just going to have to test drive it and see what might be the issue. I mean, hey, maybe you didn't know this, but your rear window motor was broken. Well, we fixed that, but you didn't fix the oscillation. So what do you think is happening? And how do you think it could be fixed? Does it invite contribution? And relating to all of that, what can we do to help? When I read through the documentation that's on your website, do I understand where I can best be of help? Is it logo development, branding evolution, human factors research, technical writing, stakeholder empathy mapping? Do you need posters made? All of that stuff is design. But if you ask a human factors researcher to do technical writing or develop a brand, they might not necessarily get you what you want. So let's talk about this for a second. Don't do this, okay? This is real, by the way. This was on a GitHub, and I believe still is, for a fitness tracking website or fitness tracking program. And this is the full extent of the documentation about design. What does prettify mean? What is design love in relation to the auto-completer should get a bit of design love? When I look at the search feature, I can see that they've already got a color for the autofill. I can see that they've already got a color for sections in the automatic results. And I can see that they've already got some graphic, some Web 2.0 graphic in that closeout symbol in the search bar. What are they looking for? An RIT student actually was connected with me to ask me, what is design? So that he could better understand exactly what it was that they were looking for, because he was that motivated to contribute to this project. These people really want to help and contribute, but when you have documentation of this caliber, it makes it very difficult for someone to actually contribute. There is one comment on this project that has been open for almost 2 years now. So ask yourself when you're writing documentation, what does the project know? What does the project need? What has the project done in this field so far? Can you answer any of these questions for this current project? Who should I contact for more information? Well, probably the guy under the red square, but this is still an open project, and I don't really feel the need to throw this guy under the bus. If you're watching, the rest of your project is really great, so, please don't come after me. What are the guidelines for visual language here? If they're looking for design love, and I don't have any guidelines on how to actually design for them, I have to do a lot of extra work at the beginning to develop a little bit of a design system. Maybe I'll do that, and then I'll tell them about it, and they'll say, well, why aren't you using our design system? Well, wasn't linked here, was it? Now I've just spent an additional 4 hours to develop a very, very pretty, well-made, efficient design system, the rudimentary beginnings of it, and I find out that they've already got a way that they've developed buttons. And again, what does prettify even mean? But let's compare it to this. This is, I'm assuming, Patty. I have never actually said it out loud. They don't know anything about design. But they do know something about accessibility. And so they make their design document as accessible as possible to designers, right? So what does the project know? Well, they haven't had loads of attention in this area, but they want help with brand and design. They want to bring thought and consistency to their overall project designs. And to do so, they've given us access to both their standard logo and a smaller logo. They've introduced guidelines as to how we are to use those logos. I mean, I don't know, I don't see a contact on this specific page as to how to refer to them, but I can contact someone in this project. And so I can understand what they're looking for in order so I can understand what they're looking for in order to provide the proper experience. No. So I can understand what they're looking for in order to provide the proper assistance with design. Talking about assistance, from the other side, let's talk about what it takes to support designers for a second. First off, feedback. Designers don't work alone. We do move in herds. So how do we provide support for an overarching design team? Can you review contributions that... Let's talk about providing feedback. Designers don't work alone. Even though they're often constrained to specific departments, designers thrive on collaborative feedback from members within their design team and members outside of the design department entirely. So ask yourself, how can I provide feedback to someone whose process I don't necessarily fully understand? Well, how do you review contributions that aren't related to design? How do you review contributions that aren't really related to design? Can you evolve your process for reviewing pull requests to include design-based submissions? Why or why not? Feedback, good feedback, looks like explaining concrete reasoning for rejected contributions, as well as providing suggestions for revisions and explaining misunderstood scope. In short, it is clear and efficient communication of necessary information. I had a freelance project that I was working on last year, and after racking up about $1,000 in fees from me, I ended up splitting from the project because the feedback that they provided meant that I was going to be doing this work, developing their logo, their brand language, developing their menus, all of this stuff for this restaurant for years, and we wouldn't ever reach an end point. Because I'd get feedback like, I don't necessarily like square letters. Okay. Or, I don't really think that this should look like it was made on a computer. At this point, I was sharing my screen on a Zoom call, displaying to him an Adobe prototype. This sort of feedback, while could be scratch all of that back to when I start talking about this freelance project. I'm going to do all of that again. I had a freelance project that I was working on at the tail end of last year. And after working with them for several months, I ended up parting ways from the project because the feedback that I received was not conducive to improving the work for the project. The feedback that they provided was things like, I'm not fond of square letters, which made little sense, or I just don't think that it should be done on a computer. I am a digital designer. I would be more than happy to draw what they were looking for in their menus and their logos But truth be told, the work that I was doing on a computer was going to be significantly better and worth the price that they were paying. What they were rejecting was the fact that it looked modern. I found out months later after having quit the project when I spoke to a friend of mine who was still working on it, and they wanted a more Disney-fied 1920s style look, which I wasn't really providing for them. I was working more in the mid-century modern style of design, but none of that was ever communicated to me in an effective way. They didn't provide the necessary feedback. And what about community support? Because designers are community members. So think about someone who doesn't necessarily have the experience of a developer. Can they understand your project? What support can they offer? And what support can you offer them? Can you recruit support for them if they don't fully understand this process? Can you have someone on your team who's dedicated to supporting design contributions? Can you have a design team? And what this looks like is mission documents in plain and understandable language, so avoiding jargon or defining it when it is absolutely necessary. It also looks like providing required design assets. You know, you don't ask someone to develop you an entire web page based on a website that you already have without providing them any of the code, any of the colors, any of the CSS at all. You give them all of that information so that they can do it quicker and they don't have to reverse engineer that from the pre-existing documents in an ideal world. You can also provide avenues for portfolio work. If a designer really wants to showcase specific work that they've done for your project, let them. It's extremely important to our career as designers that we can demonstrate the work that we've done. It also looks like building design considerations into Gantt charts and then, future Scrum or push plans, whatever nomenclature you use for it. And that's not just saying get design help week 1 through week 16. It's saying something like developing design scope week 1 to 2, developing design system, researching design systems, developing visual languages, card sort week 3, day 2. All of these different things are important to the process, and so all of those things should be built into your Gantt charts and your future Scrum plans and all of your project planning. And that might lead you to build space in your team for a long-term designer, someone who can consider those options, someone can consider those choices and those steps in the process. And also that person can then provide support to reviewing design contributions from external contributors. In closure, we are important community members and contributors. We bring skills and expertise to a project in order to help a project understand itself, understand its stakeholders, and improve the experience that its users have in adoption and use of the project. We are important members of the team, and by considering design from beginning to end of our projects, we can create a project that exceeds the expectations that it began with and truly solves the problems that we can. By considering design from the beginning to the end of the project along the entire scope, we can solve problems before they arise. We can create projects that are better suited to the needs of the contributors and the stakeholders. And overall, we can create work that is so great and helps so many people. Because that is design. Thank you. There's a couple of my socials there, and I would appreciate any reach out at all from anyone regarding anything I spoke about in this talk. Thank you.